Thank you very much, Niall. Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, attendees in the room and online. Míle fáilte ribh chudaigh atá in inniu, an seosa seomra agus ar líne. My name is Andy Bleasdale. Nature has always been a passion for me, but the notion that ecology could be a career for me became clear to me in my late teens. After completing a PhD in botany, I operated as a self-employed ecologist for a number of years in the 90s, quite a long time ago now at this stage. And I did consultancy work before joining the civil service in January 2000 and NPWS. So for me, it's been more than Fehe Blíonaigh Fós or 20 years growing in NPWS. We're here for 2 days to celebrate biodiversity. And to that end, I'll initially present some slides that showcase Ireland's amazing biodiversity and natural heritage. But we're also here to address the challenges that face us in our shared ambition to protect, to conserve, and to restore biodiversity in Ireland. Some of the beauty you see in the peatlands of Ireland. I'm very excited and honoured to be standing before you today, representing my colleagues in NPWS, and hopefully presenting a fair and reasonable summary of the challenges that we collectively face and the progress that we've made in the last number of years in NPWS, across government, but also in partnership with the people in the room, with the myriad of interested and supportive stakeholders. Again, beauty abounds, and this is a bit of light relief from some of the non-graphic presentations earlier, so some nice slides just to kind of complement my presentation. I'm passionate about working hard for nature and for biodiversity, but I also understand that wanting and knowing that change is required is often not enough to guarantee that change. So perhaps passionate and being passionate isn't the only way to get to the end point. We need to kind of engage, proactively interact, and work with others and share our passion, because we can't carry that burden on our own shoulders. I believe that the solution to any significant biodiversity challenge, if that falls on the shoulders of any one organisation, including NPWS, then we may have a problem. The biodiversity crisis cannot be solved by NPWS alone or in isolation. We therefore need the support and co-creation of solutions by government and by wider society. Nobody owns nature. It's a shared legacy that we hope to pass on. And the state doesn't often own the land that we want to manage for biodiversity. So whether we like it or not, and I respectfully suggest that we need to like it, we must work in partnership with the owners of lands and the users of the seas, and with those whose policies at government level affect these areas, if we have any hope of succeeding. We must therefore work wisely together. I strongly believe that there's a great appreciation of nature in the Irish psyche, but we have to respect property and other rights and seek to provide appropriate supports and tools for landowners, for communities, for farmers, for foresters, and for fishers to manage for nature. So why are we here? You and I, those online and present in Dublin Castle here today and tomorrow, are here at the second National Biodiversity Conference, as we all want to engage in a national conversation on biodiversity. NPWS are facilitating this event, but it is not intended to be an internal NPWS conversation. It's about hearing and listening to the voices and the views of Irish government, stakeholders and citizens about what we collectively want as a nation. And I feel that the national ambition for the conservation and restoration of biodiversity has increased significantly since the first conference in February 2019, 3 years plus ago. In May 2019, a few months after the last conference, as was referenced already this morning, the Dáil declared a national climate and biodiversity emergency. Ireland was the first country in the world after the UK to make this important declaration. And as you've already heard, the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, facilitated by the Department of An Taoiseach, is currently advancing a national discussion on biodiversity, ably chaired by Dr. Aoibhinn Ní Shúilleabháin, Monam Shiv, agus fecim go léivín sa seomra linn nniu freisin, so nach dá sé sin. So what can I say that might help stimulate the conversation over the coming days? I could spend most of my time, my allocated time, going over the negative trends in relation to biodiversity in an Irish context, informed by reporting under the Habitats and Birds Directives and other national surveys and inventories. And I will do that, but we also need to be real, as we need to be real in relation to the status of biodiversity in Ireland, so that we can move forward in an informed way. But I will also focus on what has happened since the last conference in 2019 that, to my mind, is very, very, very positive. I will also reference what we should consider committing to in the 4th National Biodiversity Action Plan that is currently in preparation to inform Ireland's plan of action for the next 5 years in relation to biodiversity, and how best to share this responsibility and this opportunity. Some nice marine slides there to form the backdrop. To some bad news. Moving on then to the 6-yearly reports prepared by the NPWS on species and habitats listed under the Habitats and Birds directives. And these have shown declines in pressures to habitats and species in our grasslands, in our peatlands, and in our marine environments. That's just a fact. But it's also heartening to know that this is not a uniquely Irish problem, but the solution to this problem, or these problems, is in the hands of us all. And if we want it, we can make it happen. According to the 2019 Article 17 report on the implementation of the EU Habitats Directive, 85% of Ireland's habitats are assessed now as being in unfavourable conservation status. 46% of our habitats are recorded to be in decline, with only 2% noted as improving. So this is somewhat depressing news, and one could get bogged down by the negativity, but that inspires me to action, and hopefully that action can be shared by us all in this room and wider society to try and address those threats and pressures to improve biodiversity under the Habitats Directive. The news is somewhat better for species, with 57% of species listed on the Habitats Directive in Ireland recorded as having favourable status in 2019, with another 30% indicated as having unfavourable status. So that's the Habitats Directive. Moving on to the Birds Directive and the listed species of 209 birds. According in 2019 to the Article 12 report on the Birds Directive, the population trends for those 209 species was somewhat mixed, some positives, some negatives. However, in the wider context of the wider countryside, we know that 60% of birds that were previously commonly occurring in Ireland are now on red or amber lists. And this includes the corncrake and the hen harrier. And unfortunately, breeding waders are perhaps the most threatened group of birds in Ireland. Many of these species, the breeding waders, rely heavily upon farmland for their survival, and this includes the curlew, lapwing, redshank, snipe, and dunlin. And it's not just birds or habitats and species, it's also butterflies and bumblebees. The National Biodiversity Data Centre has highlighted worrying declines in common butterflies and bumblebees, and approximately 1/3 of the 98 wild bee species in Ireland are under threat of extinction. That's quite a sobering statistic. The reasons for these declines in both habitats and species are very complicated. There's no one simple answer. But in the round, they are the result of ongoing and significant changes in land use and sea policy over time, and changes in agriculture and marine policy in that regard. So that's where we need to tackle these problems at a global level, rather than focusing on action directly at site level always. What have we been doing about this? The 3rd National Biodiversity Action Plan ran from 2017 to 2021. The plan comprised 7 objectives linked to many of the government bodies, agencies, universities, NGOs, businesses and community groups in this audience. It was a whole-of-government plan with an interdepartmental biodiversity working group overseeing its implementation and a multi-sectoral biodiversity forum providing external advice and perspective. When we look back on the plan, we know that there were 119 actions under a framework of 7 high-level strategic objectives. This encompassed the following: mainstreaming biodiversity into decision-making, strengthening the knowledge base for conservation, increasing awareness and appreciation of biodiversity, conserving and restoring biodiversity and ecosystem services, expanding and improving management of protected areas and species, and enhancing international governance for biodiversity. We've touched on many of these themes already this morning. We did an interim review of the plan, and that was published in February 2020, just a few years ago, and that can be reviewed on the NPWS website. Of these plans and actions in the plan, these are not ever finished entirely. This is an ongoing process. Many of the actions are still ongoing and will fall through into the next plan period as well, under the 4th Biodiversity Action Plan. And we're now working on that plan, as has been referenced this morning, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So what has happened since the last conference then? The changes delivered in NPWS alone since the last conference has been very, very significant, as mentioned this morning. And this has involved close cooperation with partners across government and with wider society. We have a brand new senior leadership team of POs in NPWS, 5 new people relative to 2 years ago. None of those 5 people were standing, and so that's change, and change is positive. So that new leadership team will work with Niall on delivering the ambition of the strategic action plan that Ciara will be talking to you about in a few minutes. But in addition to that, we've had improved staffing and funding in recent years, which again is really, really positive. Since 2020, as Minister Noonan already said this morning, funding for the NPWS has increased by 64%. With the support of Ministers O'Brien and Noonan, funding has been restored to pre-2008 levels in the 2022 budget at 47 million, approximately. Something that hasn't yet been referenced this morning, which is an important document that has been published since the last conference in 2019, is the Prioritised Action Framework for Ireland, which covers the period 2021 to 2027, and which specifies the prioritised measures required to manage the Natura 2000 network. This is a really important document that should inform funding in a suite of operational programmes on land and at sea. And I could cite the CAP strategic plan as an example of that, and the EMF-AF as well, should be informed by the Prioritised Action Framework for Ireland. And I know the evaluation of those programmes by the Commission will reference the Irish PAF, which again is a really important document. Minister Hackett mentioned the CAP, and again, while we're never perfectly resolving all of our issues in relation to farming and agriculture, I think in the last number of CAP cycles, we're seeing a steady state of improvement in that regard. The current CAP period has been extended to the end of 2022 and has delivered an increased ambition for nature relative to other cycles. I would like to specifically reference the mainstreaming of the burn programme in the current CAP. Sometimes we forget some of the successes we've made. That is a real key and important success. What was a life project, what went to a local funded project is now mainstreamed in the Irish CAP, which is really, really positive. But also, as referenced by Minister Hackett, the delivery of a large range and large number of new European innovation partnerships. Two examples of that are the Hen Harrier project and the Pearl Mussel project. And these are blueprints for localising action and delivery at local level, and the focus on what agriculture can do in that regard. In the intensive sphere of the agricultural landscape, the Bride EIP is really inspiring as well, looking at what intensive farmers can do to support biodiversity in those landscapes. So that's important too. As referenced by Minister Hackett, an ambitious new AECM, or new Agri-Environmental Climate Measure, has been drafted by DAFM, comprising 8 local cooperation projects, which will build on the successes of the EIPs and the Burn programme on an even wider scale until 2027. This is really, really exciting, to say the least. And hopefully we can build on this ambition over multiple future CAP cycles as well. So steps forward always is my goal, and never steps back. No backsliding, as the man said. The action plan for NPWS has already been mentioned a few times this morning, and it's going to bring us on an exciting journey in the coming years. My colleague Ciara, who will be talking to you in a minute, will give you an overview of the plan. So change, as I've said, is challenging, but I'm confident that NPWS is now in a better place to meet the challenges of the coming years full on. Life, another green shoot, another source of inspiration. Looking back over time, since the Life Fund was initially offered to member states in Ireland in 1992, we have delivered 20 traditional life projects in that period. And in the last few years since the last conference in 2019, 3 large integrated projects have been commenced, 2 run by this department and others as well. These are Wild Atlantic Nature, Waters of Life, and Peatlands and People. In that period, in the last 3 years, Arran Life, Kerry Life, and the Living Bog projects have concluded since the last conference and have delivered excellent results. Just to give you some backdrops and some background information in relation to Life IP Wild Atlantic Nature, quite a large project operating in the north and west, focusing in on peatlands. And that will run until at least the end of 2028. So that is a real opportunity in those landscapes to add value to the management of peatland habitat and conservation of the species and the habitats occurring in that landscape. And that gives a footprint of the geographical relevance of those sites, occurring in a vast number of SSCs and a collective group of farmers, politicians, and life project managers in that photograph as well, which is inspiring to say the least, out on the ground doing real things. Since the last conference in 2019, the NPWS has also launched 2 new life-funded projects, Concrete Life, and I note that John Carey is in the room with us today, the project manager of that project. Delighted to see you here, John. So that project, again, is at a smaller scale, focusing on a single species in the SPA network and associated hinterland of those SPAs in the west of Ireland as well, north and west. And finally, the last new, and that's the footprint of those projects, working in Donegal, Galway, and Mayo, and some of the offshore islands as well. And finally, Life on Macker is a new project just launched this year, an exciting project that aims to improve Ireland's management of mackerel, but not mackerel, that habitat for that habitat's sake only, but also the species that use it, and in particular breeding waders and pollinators. Really, really positive. Not to have a sole habitat or species focus, but to integrate those in a delivery mechanism delivered now by the project manager and her team, Catherine Farrell, who again is with us here today. So again, very, very exciting. NPWS are also involved in a suite of other LIFE projects as an associated beneficiary or partner. And finally, under the LIFE theme, just to say that Ireland has recently applied for strategic nature project funding under a new instrument provided by the EU to have national resources provided to integrate and to mainstream biodiversity challenges under that funding instrument. Ireland has partnered with DAFM and Quilty Nature, and if funding is granted in our application that was made this year, LifeSnap Ireland will hopefully, through a new conservation measures data hub, seek to improve, standardise, coordinate the identification, the tracking and the measuring of the efficacy of conservation measures, both within Natura 2000 and in the wider countryside. All going well with that funding, this will be a 9-year project working in those landscapes to integrate and manage data. Sounds a bit dry, but it's absolutely critical to gather up data that we're all collectively delivering in a single hub, a single place. And other than LIFE, we've also been working on other EU funding projects with a focus on nature and biodiversity under Interreg and in Leader and under Horizon. Focusing very briefly on Interreg 5A, which is just concluding this year. The Interreg 5A programme is currently funding action under the heading Recovery of Protected Habitats and Priority Species in 3 jurisdictions, including Ireland. 11 million of ERDF funding is being provided across the border into Northern Ireland with border counties, and 2 large cooperation projects are delivering action for habitats and species. These projects are called Collaborative Action for the Natura 2000 Network, CAN, and Cooperation of Cross Borders for Biodiversity, CAB. And I see that representatives of those projects are in the room with us today as well also. These plans are delivering very exciting things in preparing conservation action plans, fire risk plans, and delivering actual measures on the ground, such as fencing, drain blocking, etc., in a suite of sites. And this work will be further expanded in the years ahead from 2023 onwards under the heading of Peace Plus. And we're working with the SEUPB and NIEA in Northern Ireland on designing and delivering those initiatives now. The national NPWS Farm Plan Scheme, which is also nationally funded and doesn't receive any EU funding, is undergoing significant expansion in the last 3 years, and that is overseen by Dr. Barry O'Donoghue. By the end of this year, we'll have almost 330 plans prepared, and these deliver bespoke conservation measures on the ground. The staffing of the unit that delivers these plans has also been enhanced in recent years to service this increase in farm plans and to provide the capacity to better engage with farmers, the farming organisations, and the Department of Agriculture. This unit, headed up by Barry O'Donoghue, also spearheads the Curlew Conservation Programme, which has gone from strength to strength since 2019. Other positives: the NPWS grant scheme for small recording projects might sound like a small and somewhat insignificant thing in terms of its budget, but the footfall and the influence that that small fund can deliver to bring capacity to recorders who have a lack of funding to progress their recording efforts. So in that regard, we provide annual funding of up to 5,000 per annum for projects. And this scheme is growing and expanding in recent years. This year alone, we'll be funding 37 new projects with a total value of 97,000. So that is really, really positive. That small injection of cash can build capacity in the years ahead in terms of our ecologists coming forward. And just to show you some of the successful projects that we funded, just a snapshot of some of the logos developed in that period over the last 3 years as a Seed for Nature. And you can see just some very interesting projects working locally to manage and record biodiversity in their landscapes. The Local Biodiversity Action Fund is also an exciting initiative. This is also a Seed for Nature, and it provides support to local authorities with the implementation of projects that promote actions contained in the National Biodiversity Action Plan. Grants were awarded to all 31 local authorities who applied in 2021, amounting to some €1.3 million in funding. And this scheme will receive an injection of additional funding this year, up to 1.5 million in 2022, which is a 300% increase in funding in this scheme since 2019. So again, very, very successful. Not a vast amount of money, but delivering real action in local communities, spearheaded by the local authorities. Okay, Thank you, Dan. The Biodiversity Officer Programme, we've made 600,000 available this year to roll out the Biodiversity Officer Programme in local authorities around the country to assist in the implementation of the National Biodiversity Action Plan. This funding stream will enable local authorities to develop projects that can be delivered at local level. The Heritage Council, the CCMA and the LGMA are working closely with this department to bring this ambition to fruition. And I'm very glad to see Virginia Teehan of the Heritage Council in the room today, who is a very strong champion of this initiative also. Very briefly then, because time is against me and I won't go into any detail, but this slide here shows some of the other really important green shoots that are happening around the country. From the Peatlands Finance Ireland project, Business and Biodiversity Platform, the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan that DAFM and others, including ourselves, are supporting action under, and then the Farming for Nature initiative, which is, again, in the last number of years, really gathering momentum and spearheading action and selling the message that to farm for nature is an appropriate farming choice for farmers. So that's really, really positive also. Okay, my last two slides now, you'll be glad to hear. Challenges and opportunities. So again, to pull us back to the negative with the ongoing biodiversity declines with infringements taken against Ireland, one could be beaten down by the scale of the challenges to be overcome. And the biodiversity strategy, while it presents lots of opportunities to galvanise action and deliver increased ambition, it's also going to be really, really challenging to deliver in Ireland. There's just no two ways about that. And again, NPWS can't carry solely the burden of that ambition. It's going to have to be shared across government and with wider society, so that is a shared ambition that we're all working towards delivering. Delivery of the action plan for NPWS, while really inspiring actually, is also going to be challenging, and I'm sure Ciara will touch on that in her presentation. So ultimately, I think we need to work collectively together in our shared ambition in the years ahead. And one final point that I will make now before I conclude is in relation to a poem that I studied for my Irish Leaving Cert back in the, I won't say when, about 30 years ago at this stage, more than 30 years ago. It was called Stitcha by Martin O'Diron, a poet from the Aran Islands. And in that poem, which means uprooted, he left the Aran Islands as a farmer, small farmer in a small holding there, moved to Galway initially and then moved to the civil service actually in Dublin as a clerical officer, but was a poet in his pastime and wrote lots of beautiful and inspiring poetry. One of his poems that was on my Leaving Cert was Stitcha, which means uprooted. And he had a beautiful phrase in there that said, Ag bont ceart den nart na nul, which I think he meant meaning trying to manage to get the upper hand possibly on nature, to create soil and from sand and seaweed so that it could grow crops in the Aran Islands. But I think you can rephrase or look at that phrase in a different way, and you can actually look at it as being the opportunity to maximize the co-benefits that we can all derive from nature. Ag bont nart, deriving strength from nart na nul, the power of nature. So I think that's the inspiration for us all in the coming days and in the years ahead and before our next and third Biodiversity Conference in a few years' time. Thank you very, very much.